At 3:52 in the morning, my husband's phone lit up on the bedside table. Not a call, a message. I would not have seen it at all, except that I had just walked through the front door after a 34-hour shift at the hospital and was setting down my bag on the dresser when the screen glowed in the darkness. My husband was asleep, breathing slow and heavy, still dressed in the clothes he had apparently been wearing when he collapsed onto the covers. The notification showed a preview. A woman I had never seen before standing in what was clearly a hotel bathroom mirror, wearing nothing but a white towel loosely wrapped, with a message underneath that read, "Room 308. Still thinking about tonight. Don't be a stranger." The contact name read Sandra Whitfield, my husband's regional operations director at the distribution company where he had been quietly building his career for the last 2 years. I stood in that dark room holding my hospital badge, still clipped to my scrubs, and I felt something move through me that I can only describe as clinical stillness. The same stillness I reach for when a patient begins to deteriorate on the table and every decision counts. No panic, no tears, just an absolute, sharpened sense of what comes next. I picked up his phone. He had never changed the passcode since we set them together years earlier. I opened the message thread with Sandra and scrolled. There were hundreds of messages going back nearly 6 months. Photographs, voice memos, arrangements, nicknames I will not repeat because they were more pathetic than anything else. And one exchange from 4 weeks prior where Sandra had written, "Stop worrying about home. Women like her are married to the job. They never look up long enough to notice. They never do." Plural. Not she will never notice. They never do. That choice of words rewired something in my thinking. I screenshotted the entire conversation, every message, every photo, every arrangement they had made, and forwarded it all to my personal email. Then I set his phone back on the nightstand exactly as it had been, walked downstairs to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, sat at the counter we had renovated together 3 years ago during what I had thought was a hopeful chapter in our lives. I drank the water slowly, thought precisely. My name is Claire. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon at a major medical center in Atlanta, Georgia. I am 41 years old. I have been married to my husband, who I will call Nathan, for 11 years. We met at a colleague's dinner party when I was wrapping up my fellowship, and he was a junior operations manager trying to find his footing in a competitive industry. He was attentive in a way that felt genuine. He remembered the small things, the way I took my tea, that I could not stand the smell of lavender, that I always kept a paperback in my coat pocket because I hated wasting waiting time. We married 2 years after that dinner party at a small gathering on the North Carolina coast. 60 guests, my father gave a toast that made everyone cry. His mother pulled me aside afterward and said I had given her son something to rise toward. I believed her. I believed all of it. But the thing about being a surgeon is that you are trained to see what most people overlook. A bruise pattern that suggests something deliberate, a heart rhythm that hesitates in a way no one else catches, a patient who insists they are fine while their body says otherwise. I had been noticing things about Nathan for months. A new fitness routine that never seemed to produce any visible changes, but required him to leave at odd hours. Work trips that suddenly needed an extra night. The way he had started turning his phone face down on every surface, something he had never done in a decade together. And the watch, that was what unsettled me first. A new watch, expensive looking, one I had never bought him, and that he could not have afforded easily on his own. When I asked about it, he said a colleague had given him a deal. He did not name the colleague. His eyes shifted slightly to the right when he answered, which in my experience means someone is arranging a story rather than remembering one. I said nothing at the time, not because I was in denial, because I needed evidence. In surgery, you do not open a patient based on instinct alone. You gather data, you image, you confirm your findings before you ever lift a scalpel. So 3 months before that message appeared on his phone at 3:52 in the morning, I had begun my own careful process. I hired a forensic accountant named Vera Okonkwo, a former federal examiner who had transitioned to private practice and specialized in financial reconstruction and asset tracing. I brought her in because I had started noticing things in our shared accounts. Small withdrawals I couldn't match to any purchase, credit card charges at hotels and restaurants in cities where Nathan claimed to be at industry conferences, amounts that did not line up with the receipts he sometimes left visible on the kitchen counter. Vera confirmed within 10 days that Nathan had opened a separate account 8 months earlier and had been quietly siphoning money from our joint savings. Not dramatic amounts, a few hundred here, 1,200 there, but across 8 months it had added up to just over $17,000, all of it traceable to hotel stays, private dinners, gifts, and a long weekend in Savannah he had described to me as a required leadership retreat. But Vera found something else, something that made the affair feel almost secondary by the time I understood it fully. Sandra Whitfield had a pattern. Vera's financial mapping of Nathan's spending led her to cross-reference Sandra's employment history, and what she uncovered was systematic. Sandra had moved through 5 companies in 14 years, departing each time under language like voluntary transition or organizational realignment. At 3 of those companies, formal complaints had been submitted by spouses of male employees who fell within Sandra's direct chain of supervision. Each complaint described the same sequence: a senior woman in authority using professional mentorship as the opening, converting access into personal attention, building intimacy through business travel and late evenings, and then, when the relationships came to light, the men lost their positions, while Sandra walked away with positive references and a better title at the next company. The complaints had been resolved quietly with settlements and confidentiality agreements. The men had been too humiliated to push back, the wives had been too drained, and Sandra had moved on, untouched, every single time. That word in her message, they, she was not talking about surgeons, she was talking about wives, about the women who had been standing exactly where I was standing before me. So when I sat at my kitchen counter at 4 a.m. with $17,000 in documented transfers on my phone, I was not reacting. I had been preparing for months. What Sandra did not know, what Nathan certainly did not know, was that I had already assembled something that would reach far further than either of them expected. I did not sleep that night. At 6:15, Nathan came downstairs in an old t-shirt and workout shorts, looking fully rested and completely at ease. He kissed my cheek and asked whether my shift had been rough. "Long," I said. He poured himself coffee. I watched him move through our kitchen like a man who had nothing to answer for. I thought about how many other women had watched exactly this, their husbands performing the ordinary morning ritual of a life they had quietly been burning down. I thought about how many other kitchens had held this exact scene and how few of those women had known what I knew. I waited 5 days. During those 5 days, I finalized everything with Vera. I retained a divorce attorney named Marguerite Flood, who was widely regarded in Atlanta for handling complex financial cases. I organized every document I had collected, and I reached out to a woman named Teresa Bonham, whose husband had worked under Sandra's supervision at her previous employer nearly 4 years before. Vera had located Teresa through records tied to a confidential settlement. Teresa had signed a non-disclosure agreement as part of a quiet separation package after her husband was eased out of his role following the exposure of his affair with Sandra. But when I called her, Teresa said she had spent 4 years wishing she had made a different choice. "I knew she would do it again," Teresa said, her voice controlled but tight. "The moment I signed those papers, I knew. I took the money because I was exhausted and scared and I just needed it to be over, but I paid for my silence with knowing that she was already somewhere finding the next one." Teresa agreed to provide a detailed written account of what she had experienced. She said she did not care anymore about the agreement she had signed. She said her only real regret was that she had waited this long to say any of it aloud. On the 5th evening, I came home to find Nathan on the sofa watching something on television. He looked up and smiled. I sat down across from him. I said, I know about Sandra Whitfield." The remote slipped from his hand and dropped to the floor. His face moved through several expressions in the space of a few seconds. Confusion first, then understanding, then something close to dread, then a desperate attempt at steadiness that did not hold. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Claire, I can explain." "You cannot, and that is not actually why I am raising this. I am not looking for your explanation because I already know more than you do about what has been happening." He stared at me. "What does that mean?" "It means I have spent the last 3 months documenting, not just your affair, Sandra's complete professional history, the other marriages she dismantled, the other men she targeted, the financial paper trail you created to fund this relationship using money from our joint accounts." The color had left his face, not the flush of guilt, the pallor of someone who has just understood that the floor is not where they thought it was. "Other marriages?" he said quietly. "What other marriages?" I placed the folder on the coffee table between us, a physical folder, because I wanted him to see the weight of what I had collected. Vera's financial reconstruction, Teresa's written account, Sandra's employment records showing the recurring pattern of departure, a second statement from a woman named Bridget, whose husband had been targeted at the company before Teresa's. I spread the documents across the table the way you lay out imaging before a difficult procedure, each one revealing a different layer of the same damage. "You were not special, Nathan. I need you to understand that clearly before we say anything else. You were a married man in a role where she had direct authority over your career advancement. She recognized that you were ambitious and quietly unsure of yourself. She offered the specific validation you were most susceptible to, professional encouragement that became personal attention, that became physical involvement. It is the same approach she has used for 14 years. He picked up Teresa's statement and read the first page. Then he set it down and pressed his hands over his face. "I thought it was real." "She is interested in leverage," I said, "not in you. The affair was never the point. The point was ensuring that you were professionally and personally indebted to her deeply enough that you would never challenge her or report her conduct." We sat in silence for a long time after that. Nathan cried. I did not. I had already moved through my grief during those 5 careful days, alone in my car in the hospital parking structure between procedures, allowing myself exactly the time I needed before pulling myself back together and walking back through those doors. Surgeons learn early that the feelings will be there when you return to them. In the moment, you have to remain steady. "I need you to be out by the end of the week," I said finally. "The divorce filing has already been submitted. Marguerite Flood is handling my side. Her contact information is in the folder." "Claire, 11 years. Please, can we at least talk to someone before you close this entirely? You transferred $17,000 of our money to fund this. You lied to me for 6 months. And while I was working 30-hour shifts keeping people alive, you were in hotel rooms with a woman who has built her career on destroying marriages. There is nothing to counsel." He left 3 days later, 2 bags. He paused at the car and looked back at the house. I was standing at the window. I did not wave. 8 days after Nathan moved out, a call came from a number I did not recognize. The voice on the other end was composed and deliberate, carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to controlling rooms. "This is Sandra Whitfield. I understand you have been looking into my background. I want you to know that whatever you believe you have found, it will not survive scrutiny. I have outstanding legal representation. My professional record speaks entirely for itself, and I have the full backing of my company's senior leadership, who understand my value considerably better than the grievances of disgruntled former spouses. 2 of those former spouses are prepared to testify. Their accounts are already documented and held across multiple locations. Your financial history shows a consistent departure from organizations following the filing of conduct complaints. I have 6 months of messages between you and my husband, including materials that demonstrate a relationship between a senior executive and a direct subordinate. Your organization's own policies explicitly prohibit exactly this. A pause. Then, what do you want? I want your resignation, immediate, voluntary. And I want you to understand that if you relocate to another company and continue this pattern, I will make certain that everything I have documented follows you. I am not a logistics coordinator's wife who can be quieted with legal pressure. I am a surgeon with the resources to match your attorneys and the professional reach to ensure this information finds every hiring committee and industry forum in your sector. Another silence, longer this time. Then she said something I had not anticipated. You think you are different, smarter, more prepared, but you are not. You are just another woman whose husband looked elsewhere because she was not enough. All the credentials and the investigations and the righteous composure, none of it changes the fact that he picked me. He did not pick you, I said. My voice was level, because I had spent years learning to keep it level in rooms where people's lives depended on my steadiness. You identified him. You selected him the way you selected every man before him. The reason I am different from the others is not that I am stronger. It is that I refuse to let you do this to the next one. She ended the call without another word. 3 weeks later, Vera called to let me know that Sandra had submitted her resignation, citing personal circumstances. The company had accepted it without public statement, though Vera's contacts inside indicated a substantial internal review was underway regarding supervisory conduct and complaint procedures. But the piece of the story I had not planned for, the piece that still stays with me, happened on a Sunday afternoon about 6 weeks after Nathan moved out. My younger sister, Diane, drove up from Savannah to spend the weekend. I had told her everything, the affair, the investigation, the filing. She had listened thoughtfully, and I had expected that to continue. Instead, over lunch at a place near my apartment, she said, "Are you certain you are not taking this further than it needs to go?" I set down my fork. Nathan made a terrible choice, but you two built something over a long time, 11 years. Is that not worth at least trying to save? Diane, I said, you ended your own marriage after James cheated. You told me it was the hardest and most necessary thing you had ever done. That was different. James chose to do what he did. Nathan was targeted by someone who had power over him. Does that not change the calculation at all? No, it does not. I just think you should consider whether this is who you want to be, dismantling his career, her career, whether that is the version of yourself you are most proud of. I looked at my sister across that table and recognized something I had seen in the families of difficult patients, the resistance to accepting a reality that unsettles their understanding of how things are supposed to go. Diane had shaped a significant part of her identity around being the woman who had survived betrayal and moved through it with grace. If I simply walked away, that validated her path. But if I went further, if I pursued accountability beyond just leaving, it raised the question of whether she could have done more in her own situation. I love you, I said, but I am not asking for your approval. We did not speak for nearly a month after that lunch. When she finally called, she apologized without qualification. She said her therapist had helped her see that she had been pressing her own unfinished feelings onto my choices. We talked for close to 2 hours. We cried. We laughed about how absurd it was that two women who loved each other could not simply be honest sooner. Something between us settled that afternoon, something that had been quietly loosening long before Nathan's affair brought it to the surface. 7 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an email from a woman named Adrienne Marsh. She introduced herself as the wife of a man who had worked under Sandra's supervision at the company before the one where Nathan had been employed. Adrienne had heard about my situation through Teresa, who had remained in quiet contact with several of the women whose lives Sandra's pattern had touched. I wanted to reach out, Adrienne wrote. When it happened to me, I was not in a place to fight it. I signed everything they put in front of me and spent 3 years trying to pretend I had made peace with it. What I could never shake was the certainty that she would find someone else because I had made it easy for her to walk away clean. What you did, refusing to absorb it quietly, gave the rest of us something I did not know we needed: permission. Adrian asked if I would be willing to meet with her and 2 other women who had lived some version of this same experience. I agreed without hesitation. We gathered on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop with wide windows and a corner table nobody else was using. 4 women with lattes going cold beside us, each one finally saying the parts of the story that had never had a proper audience. Teresa was there, Adrian, and a woman named Colette, whose husband had been Sandra's first known target 15 years earlier at the company where Sandra had been first given authority over other people's careers. Colette told us that she had known something was wrong when her husband began working every weekend without explanation, that she had found receipts in a jacket pocket, that when she confronted him directly, he had broken down completely and told her everything, that the company had offered her $60,000 and a confidentiality agreement, and that she had accepted because she had 3 children, no independent savings, and nowhere else to turn. $60,000, Colette said. Not with bitterness, but with the flat clarity of someone who had done the math 1,000 times. That is what they decided 15 years of my life was worth. That is what it cost them to keep me quiet so their executive could keep doing exactly what she wanted. We talked for nearly 5 hours. By the time we stood to leave, something had genuinely shifted. We were no longer 4 separate women carrying private damage. We were witnesses to a pattern that had persisted for 15 years because institutions had consistently chosen their own reputation over the people who had been harmed, and because each of us alone had been made to feel that what happened to us was a personal failure rather than a structural one. I drove home that afternoon and called a journalist named Miriam Castillo, who covered institutional accountability for a major national publication. I told her I had a story, not about my marriage, about a pattern of systemic failure that had protected the same behavior for 15 years while quietly burying the women it harmed. Miriam listened. Then she asked whether the others would go on record. I told her I would ask. All 4 said yes without hesitation. The piece published 5 weeks later. It was thorough and precise. Miriam had reconstructed the full timeline: 15 years, 5 companies, at least 7 confirmed cases following an identical arc. She had obtained responses from 2 of the organizations involved, both of which issued carefully managed statements about their commitment to reviewing workplace conduct policies. She had spoken with an employment law specialist who explained in plain terms how confidential settlements and non-disclosure agreements create the exact conditions that allow this kind of behavior to continue across organizations uninterrupted. My phone did not stop for days. Colleagues, friends, Nathan, who called 9 times before I stopped answering. His primary concern was how the article reflected on him professionally. He never once acknowledged the other men. He never once said anything about the marriages that had been broken before his, or what it meant that he had been part of something much larger than his own choices. A year has passed since that message appeared on my husband's phone in the dark at 3:52 in the morning. I live alone now in an apartment 3 minutes from the hospital. It is smaller than the house was. It is exactly right. I chose everything in it myself. I hung artwork I actually wanted. I keep my hours the way my work requires, which sometimes means I come home after midnight to quiet rooms. That quiet has become something I protect. It feels like room to breathe rather than absence. I still operate. I still hold lives in my hands on ordinary Tuesday mornings. I still carry a paperback in my coat pocket because I still hate wasting waiting time, and I still believe that small personal rituals are not luxuries, but necessities. Diane and I are closer now than we have been since we were young. She visited last month, and we spent 2 days cooking the dishes our mother used to make when we were children. We did not speak about Nathan or Sandra or any of it. We just cooked and talked and occupied the same space the way sisters do when they have finally stopped performing and started simply being together. Theresa sends me a short message every few weeks, sometimes a book she has started reading, sometimes a photo of something unremarkable and lovely, the way a friend sends you evidence that life is still happening normally. Small gestures from someone who understands what it is to carry a thing for years in isolation, and then finally set it down in a room full of people who already know its weight. Adrienne has gone back to work in a field she left behind when her marriage collapsed. Colette told me recently that her youngest daughter is leaving for university in the fall, and that she finally told her children the truth about why their family had changed when they were small. She said it felt like releasing something she had been holding at arm's length for 15 years. Sometimes, late at night, after a long shift, I think about that notification glowing in the dark bedroom, about the message that was intended to mark something, to communicate possession and confidence, and the certainty that there would be no consequence. The word "they" dropped so casually by someone who had done this so many times that the women on the other end had become interchangeable to her. She thought that message was evidence of her power, proof that she could take what she wanted from other people's lives and leave without being followed. She was wrong. It was the thing that made the entire pattern visible. It was the evidence that allowed 4 women to stop absorbing their experiences privately and start saying them out loud where they could be heard and understood and held up to the light for what they actually were. I did not set out to dismantle anyone's professional standing. I set out to protect the woman who otherwise would have been sitting in a dark bedroom 6 months from now, staring at a glowing phone screen, believing that what she was feeling was the end of everything. If my refusal to stay quiet meant that woman never had to sit where I sat, then every difficult, exhausting, painstaking moment of this past year was worth every second of it. Because here's what I understand now that I only partially understood before. Silence is not composure. Silence is not strength. Silence is not what people mean when they say they handled it with dignity. Silence is permission. It is the thing that allows the next person to be harmed in exactly the same way, in exactly the same rooms, with exactly the same words. And the most precise thing you can do when someone has decided you are disposable is to demonstrate, calmly and methodically and with documentation, that you are anything but. Before you go, I want to thank you for being here with me through this. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about someone in your own life who deserves accountability, or someone who deserves to know they are not carrying this alone, please consider subscribing to Concealed Bonds and turning on your notifications. We share stories like this one every week, stories about clarity and truth, and the particular kind of quiet courage it takes to refuse to disappear. Leave a comment and tell me which moment landed hardest for you. Was it the message at 3:52 in the morning? Was it that word, they? Was it 4 women at a corner table finally saying out loud what they had been holding alone for years? I want to hear from you. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, send it to them. You never know whose silence you might help them put down. I will see you in the next one.